welcome back to Beyond Blender. This is part 2 of the ZX Spectrum fictional promotion based on a fictional brief for a fictional company, and you're working as a designer, so this is the concept that I came up with. So this in part 2 we'll be continuing obviously where we left off from part 1, and in part 1 we created the ZX Spectrum text and various icons and the joystick you can see there. The icons were created in another bit of software, and I thought that would be cool because it was all very blocky and retro looking, so I went with that. And unfortunately there were some headaches with that approach because having imported the OBJ files, there were some glitches in the model which as you'll see, I tried to clean up. I tried to recreate some of the faces, and no matter what I did, it just didn't seem to fix those particular models. So I think I'm going to say at this point it's either a bug in Blender with its OBJ import code, or which I actually think that's unlikely because I've done that many times before without any problems. My guess is that the export from the other software had some additional code in there that Blender is struggling to work with. So no matter what I did to the model, it just ended up having these visual glitches, I guess. But you know, you'll see that later on and how I tried to fix that, and in some cases failed mostly, to be fair. So yeah, we left off where we left, pick up where we left off from last time, and see how we go in today's video. So all I'm doing here is just using, as I say, the color picker to pick some of these colors. I might go back and change them again later on, depending on how the overall composition looks, really. Very simple shaders at this point, not much to it, but I will be adding, kind of discoloration, a flatted look to them. So trying to make them a little bit more used, and we'll go through that process later on. Okay, I'm happy with that. I've got the 4 main icons given a material there, all very different colors, which is good. So now we'll work on the joystick. So we've got those lovely retro red buttons and the stem at the top there in red as well, and the rest of it would just be a very simple dark grey black colour. And if you remember, we grouped the ZX lettering to the empty box there, and you can see that here I'm just having a look at the text to see how the materials were made. Well, just get a feel for the materials really, and whether they complement the rest of the icons. So a bit more work to do yet. And here's the one I mentioned earlier, the distressed thing. So I'm going to use this fingerprints texture from ambientcg.com. I'll put a link to that in the description. And we're also going to grab a HDRI from polyhaven.com, of course. The go-to place for HDRIs. Thank you, Polyhaven. Awesome stuff. And did you know that Blender uses a particular format for its OpenGL for its normal maps? So if you have the wrong type, it can result in some odd looking normals on the textures. So luckily when you download these from AmbientCG, you do have the option in some cases to use a DirectX version of the normal map or a OpenGL version. So of course, I just grabbed the OpenGL version there, and you saw on the file name it says normal GL, so you know which one's which. So let's bring them into Blender, and we're going to use the Node Wrangler add-on for this because firstly you should have that on by default every time. I wish Blender would just have that turned on by default, and secondly it just makes life so much easier when creating shaders. And most people just know it when you can click like the principled BSDF shader, for example, and then hit Control T, and that will add an image texture, mapping coordinates and UV mapping. Now that's great if you want to add just one texture, but you can also hold down Control Shift T, and that will load in multiple textures, and the Node Wrangler will intelligently work out what the normal is, which one's the diffuse, which one's the roughness, and so on, and put them all into the appropriate slots for you. So just a time-saving feature there. Highly recommended, by the way. So here we're just selecting the fingerprints. I think it was the roughness we picked there. We only need a black and white version of it, so I'm changing the color space to non-color because it doesn't have any color data in it. And we're gonna unconnect that from the diffuse because we already have a color for that, so we want to keep that kind of cyan aqua green. Now in hindsight, this was a mistake. I think I overcomplicated this, and what I'm doing here is I want to mix these two principled BSDF shaders so that one of them, so basically the fingerprints texture will control the difference between those two principled BSDF shaders. And I had no real reason to do that in hindsight because I've used other techniques where you would simply connect the fingerprints texture into the roughness slot, and that would be enough to give it a little bit of variation in the roughness to make it look a bit more not realistic as such, but just give it a little bit more of a distressed look on its surface. So what I'm doing here is just test the theory where the two shaders are obviously being separated by the texture there, the texture map. I made one bright red so that I can obviously see the difference between the two. Now I'm not seeing the red as much here, so I think what I have to do here is make a little bit of space there and add a converter color ramp, which we're going to use a lot, and that will just help us crunch the darks or the lights areas and help us visualize that the difference, the mask effectively between those two shaders. So I'll just turn on the keyboard shortcuts thing there, sorry about that. And Control-Shift-Click, as I did there on the color ramp, and again that's the node wrangler doing that feature. It will allow you to see just that node and the previous nodes connected to it. So you will see how that node's affecting the shader network basically. It's a great way of visualizing, what you're doing on a particular shader. And you can see there, just by crunching down the whites, having more white, it's bringing out the red in the second shader, which is what we want. So I'm just working to find a little bit of a balance here. And once I've done that, I can then change the red to anything I want, obviously a different color, and change all its parameters as well. As I said though earlier, I didn't really need to do this. It was a bit over the top. But when you're working on a task like this, where you've got a deadline effectively, right? And you might have, not even a day to do this. So you often go to the first thing that comes to your mind. And this is the first thing that I thought of was, let's use a texture map as a mask, and the fingerprints one is there. And then I thought, I'll just blend between two shaders, where as opposed to using a previous method that I used, which is just slotting that into the roughness slot. Here I'm changing the UV type from I think it was flat to box or plain to box, and that would allow the texture to be effectively projected in a box fashion, so top, left, right, bottom, that kind of thing, front and back. And you'll also notice there's a blending value there, and the blending value is so good because if you've got a hard edge between the front, say, and the side, the blending option will blend those seams effectively and make them disappear, which is a really handy way of getting some really cool textures quickly on your models. So you can see, as I'm pivoting around the model, the lighting is acting in different ways. Let's just use a HDR, and depending on the angle and the roughness, I guess, and it will be really obvious in some views, but not so obvious from other angles. And you can see there, I felt it's a little bit too strong, and it's just the way it is. So I upped the roughness on the first shader to 250 or 0.25, just to make that a little bit less shiny. And I'm going back to the color ramp and seeing how that adjustment can perhaps tone it down a little bit. Again, I probably spent far too much time on this. It would have been better to actually set up the scene, set up your lighting, and then see how these textures work within your, I guess, final composition, and then you can make those micro adjustments later on. I went straight ahead and did them now, but in hindsight, again, I don't think that was the best option. So in the color ramp, the black color is effectively 0 in the roughness as a value, so that would be very shiny, and white would be the opposite of that. It would be matte, a value of 1. So by toning the white to a grey, I'm making it less reflective and giving it more roughness, so I don't get that kind of mottled look to the final shader. So I'm looking again at the shaders here and perhaps changing a few more parameters, making it metallic on the first shader, turn up the roughness on the second one so it's not as reflective. So that's looking good, and again, depending on the angle, and in fact I'm actually turning it back up again now because it's too low, but then if I change the angle, there it goes, it's much stronger again depending on the lighting, and I'll probably turn that back down again now. There you go. Now I appreciate this can be a little bit boring to watch, but this is the kind of stuff that you go through, right? When you're trying to figure things out, trying to make things look the way you want them to look. It's trial and error much of the time. And what I've done here is, rather than replicating everything from scratch, I selected the previous nodes in the other shader from the Ghost and copied them. So select them and press Ctrl C if you're on a PC. Copy those shader nodes, go to another shader and just hit Ctrl V, and that will paste it back into the shader editor. So it just cuts out some of the work for you. And we're going to bring in the normal and see how that works. And to connect up the mapping to that as well, so it matches the texture as well. Let's make it a bit more space. And when working with normal maps, you need to add obviously a normal map node. Put that into the color slot and connect that to the normal slot on the principal BSDF. And we mustn't forget to change the color space as well, and to non-color. There we go. Otherwise it just won't work properly, because a normal map, even though it looks colorful as a raw image, it doesn't contain any color data as such, like it would do if it was a diffused texture. So what I'm looking for here is obviously the effect of the normal map, and I'm not seeing it, I don't think so. I increased the strength and I still couldn't see it, which was a bit weird. It should be very straightforward. So I'm just figuring out what I need to do now to make that really kick into the shaders. So I turned the blending off there just for a second. So I'm trying to find an angle now that works with the HDRI in the background, that gives us that really shows us the normal map working. You can see there it is working, but it's so subtle. Again, hindsight is a wonderful thing. It does work, but these things are not going to be really close up, and we're not rendering to a really high resolution. So whether you need to spend the time doing this, if I was to do this again, I wouldn't add the normal map. It really didn't add anything, unless you really exaggerated it and made it much larger and more obvious. So again, rather than me having to recreate all that stuff, I'm just going to copy the nodes from the red one, paste them in, connect it up to the output, and drag the color from there to there. You can also hover over a color value, or any value or field in Blender, and just hover your mouse over it and press Ctrl C, and that will copy that value or color, and then hover over your destination and then press Ctrl V, and that will paste it in. That's really handy. So yeah, so once we figure this out, we can just repeat the same process over and over. So I continue to make micro adjustments as I feel it's necessary, and once I'm happy with that, it's a process of, okay, let's just copy these nodes again, put them into the other materials as well. So again, I'm just disconnecting the main shader there, paste in the red one, connect it up, copy, paste, and delete the original. So now you can see that on the yellow one. You can kind of see there the issue that we have with those OBJ files that I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the video. You see those streaks, horizontal streaks? Now I don't know why that's happening. Those are just flat polygon planes, so there's no reason for that to happen. There's no seams, there's no sharp edges, there's no weights added to the model. And you can see there the horizontal lines have disappeared from that angle, but they're back again at this angle, which is really strange. And clearly, if you compare that to the controller, the joystick next to it, which I created in Blender, just from a cube, you don't get that. It doesn't happen. So this is where I'm looking at the model now thinking, well, do I have internal faces perhaps? Are these cubes 4 cubes all just up against each other? So I select all the vertices and merge by distance, and that removed the 0. So it wasn't that we had internal faces. So back to rendered view. Still thinking about why it's doing that. It's really bugging me actually. But we'll soldier on for now. I'll speed this bit up for you because you don't want to watch the same thing a million times. In fact, we've got a surprise for the joystick later on. We'll have to wait and see. Again, depending on I think because of the different colours here, these being much darker than the other colours that I've used, the way it looks, like the normal and maybe the roughness values are slightly more either pronounced or subdued, so I made some micro adjustments again. And you would do that as you go along and go through, try things out. And you can see again there with the heart shape, those horizontal streaks, same as the star. I don't know why they're happening. I checked the model and couldn't see any problems with it. And these are the ones I created in the third-party software. So there must be something in that code, the OBJ code, that Blender doesn't really like or doesn't know how to interpret. and hence these visual glitches. So it looks fine as in solid shading, everything looks really nice, but as soon as you put it into rendered mode, you get those streaks again. I mean, you could argue that it doesn't really matter because, again, these are going to be quite small, and it might add another, it might just be a look that works for it, right? Because it's kind of blocky and pixelated, so it might be a happy accident maybe. Let's wait and see. So here I'm checking the normals, make sure that we haven't got any erroneous normals facing the wrong way, and as you can see, they're all pointing in the right direction. So it's not the normals, so we'll turn that back down and turn it off once we've verified that. Yeah, that's all looking good. No reason for them to be glitchy. Now, any sane person at this point would have thought delete and just create my own shapes in Blender. But I thought, you know, we've got them, let's use them. It's kind of fitting for the look that we're going for, so I kept them in. I think any other project I wouldn't have accepted these and just deleted them and started from scratch with myself, just making them in Blender, no problem at all. They're very basic shapes, so here I'm just updating the text materials as well. So I use the same shader tree network as the icons. I'm just double checking the values I gave for things like the roughness and making sure that they carried over to the new nodes that I've added there. Yeah, and that works really well. You can see some of the distressed look. Very subtle, but it adds another dimension to the materials. And obviously we're not going for hyper-realism here. Once we're happy with that, we can just remove the old shader. I did play around with the clear coat, I think initially way back, but that didn't really work for me, so it didn't make much of a difference. And there you have it. So just go through every single one now, and I'll speed this up again because it can be very boring and tedious, but again, this is part of the job, right? This is what you have to do. It doesn't take long, and you'll be glad you did it because it just works, and you know how you've made that and why it works and what you need to change if you need to make changes. That's looking really nice. I just changed the location there just so I get a better placement of the fingerprints. You can see the normals working as well. Yeah, that's looking cool. I think that works. Gives it another kind of look to the final finish. So now I'm just looking at the models again, and Sherlock Holmes has dropped in to say hi because he also can't figure out what's going on with these icons. Maybe you can. If you do have some ideas, please let me know in the comments section. So now I'm going to spend some time looking at these models and trying to figure out, okay, how can I fix this? Can I maybe recreate the faces? Can I inset them and maybe that would fix it perhaps? That would just give it a nudge to render correctly. So I've selected the front faces and then switch into the back side of the view, which is, if you press 1 on your numpad, you can press Control 1 to flip the camera to the other side. And that works in top view as well as the side view. So I've selected the faces and inset them in the hope that that would get rid of those horizontal artifacts. So I felt quite confident actually doing this, and let's see what happens. Add a couple of edge loops there with Control R and push them out to the edge. At this point I was thinking perhaps I should add a subdivision surface modifier, but if I did do that, that would make all of those corners a lot trickier to control, so not a good idea. As you can see, back to rendered view, the glitches are still there. we still get those lines horizontal. So that didn't work, so let's undo that. So now I'm thinking, what else can I do? I really don't want to have to spend a lot of time on this because, like I said, I could have just made these from scratch anyway. They're so simple. But I want to try and salvage these. So again, select the first, the front faces, then the back. And by the way, to get that circular selection brush, just press the C key. So I selected those faces and deleted them. If they're not working, let's delete them, right? And make our own new faces. So we select the edges and press F to fill. And that kind of worked, but then I'm thinking the UV maps look all wrong, even though the fingerprints look okay. So I'm going to investigate the UVs first and see if that fixes it. Could it be that? Changed it from object to generated. And that will fix, well, I thought it was fixed. Let's have a look. So let's change all of these to generated. And sometimes you might find object works for the UV mapping, texture coordinates. Other times generated works. And of course, if you've UV unwrapped it, you use UVs instead. But if you just want to get something quickly on a model, object or generated works really well. So I'm just going through all of those shaders and updating them all. Tedious stuff, right? Welcome to my world. But it's also fun, don't let me put you off. These are just the things that you learn as you go along, and best practices as well, that kind of stuff. And these are the kind of things, the tips you can pass on to your colleagues. So, you know, somebody might be working on a model, they've got a glitch or a problem that you've come across before, and you can let them know how you solved it. It's always good to share that knowledge. So I'm selecting the faces here, and I'm going to try and insert again and see if that does anything. And even more tedious, I'm going to select individual vertices and press the J key to join them, effectively create an edge and create polygons. Now, some of these polygons will have more than 4 sides to them, of course, but that's not a deal breaker. Let's just see what happens. So with that done, let's switch to render view. And nope, we still get the artifacts, even though they look kind of different, a little more like bandages now. Yeah, very strange. I've never seen this before in Blender, so I really don't know if it's a bug in Blender or she doesn't know either. Thanks for dropping in, by the way. It's a dad joke for you. So yeah, I really don't know what to do with this. I just kept it in the end as it is. Here I'm trying the shading terminator because that's a new feature we're recently introduced into Blender to fix shading artifacts. So especially for low res, low poly models, that didn't make any difference either. So I'm just checking to see, you know, perhaps normal's auto smooth would work. That wasn't on, but that didn't seem to make a difference either. Now I'm just checking through some of the other values within here to see if we can help the situation anywhere. So you notice I made a backup of the original object just in case things went badly. It's a good tip, always keep a backup of your model. Just hit Shift D to make a duplicate of that model and hide it, and then you can always bring it back if you need to go back to the beginning. So at this point I decided, let's just go with it, it's fine. It's not the end of the world, it will still look good, and I think it will work really well. So I just learned next time to create these myself from scratch. And what I'm doing here is just placing these finished assets around the text. Still haven't really decided how we're gonna fit all this together into a composition, although I did do a quick sketch beforehand which I probably should have shown you, but I don't have it on the computer. So I was thinking of like in fact you can see it on the beginning of the video, on the final asset. It's almost like a chimney stack, and as you see there, I've just blown up and deleted the joystick. And you might be wondering, why did I do that? Well, the joystick doesn't really match the other icons as a set. It's got a lot more depth to it and it doesn't really suit the style. So what I did, probably foolishly, is create this, which is an old style controller. Again, very simple. In fact, I created this with a different bit of software online again. I forget what it was called, and I brought it in to see how that worked. So as you can see, it came in with an empty, and everything was parented to that empty, and it came out really big. So we'll select that empty, scale it down, and place it next to the other ones. I think you'll agree it just works so much better than the joystick. Just bring that into line with the others. Now we don't really need all of those individual meshes for the controller, so I will eventually merge them into one. As you can see, they're individual cubes, so I selected all of those just by clicking and dragging, and press Ctrl J, which will join all of those together into one mesh. You can see in the outliner in the top right, we've just got the mesh. So I selected the empty and deleted it, and the mesh disappeared. It's still there, but now it's all the way up there. Look at the size of that. And oh, hi kitty. And yeah, its orientation has now gone a little bit weird, so we just rotate it and scale it down and bring it back down again with the others. And we also want to reset the scale and rotation values as well. This is when I noticed, I don't know if you've noticed it, but that's got a W value under rotation, not just X, Y, and Z, or Z. And Blender's objects don't normally have that. You can see as I switched on to these Pac-Man. And apparently this is a component of the quaternion. I have no idea what that is. I did look it up, and you can pause the video and read that text that just came up to explain what that is. Apparently it's quite common, but I've never seen that in Blender before. So now I've just selected that controller and assigned the material that we made. In fact, using the ghost one. So by clicking on those little file icon, I duplicated the shader, renamed it to controller, and we're going to make some slight adjustments to the color. I think we'll go for white or an off-white, because that's what the old style controller tended to be. Perhaps not for the Spectrum, but certainly for other companies I could mention, which I won't, for copyright reasons. They're quite strict apparently. There you go. So we've got a pink, white, red, yellow, and a cyan. So we've got a good mix of colours we can work with there. I'm going to switch up the HDRI again, see how these look and how they behave in different lighting situations. And that brings us to the end of this video. So there you have it. This is the end of part 2. Join me in part 3 when things get really interesting and we start actually compiling the final scene, if you like. And that's the exciting bit, much more exciting than this. And again, sorry if this is a little bit boring, but the whole point of this of these videos is to show you the process that designers have to go through, trial and error, and we learn as we go along, right? So thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.